4:47 a.m., May 14, 2026, San Diego, California. 14 unmarked federal vehicles sat in 4 staging areas across the city. Engines running, lights off. Estimated fraud, $38, $2 million. Billed to the United States Navy over 18 months. Not one component delivered. Inside a black SUV on Harbor Drive, a Homeland Security Investigations supervisor checked his watch for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Across town, 3 HSI tactical elements waited on encrypted radio channels for the same signal. Each team had a target. Each target had a role in the same network. Every arrest had to happen within a 12-minute window. One team early. One subject tipped off. 18 months of work gone. The supervisor picked up a folder from the seat beside him. Inside, 214 fraudulent invoices, shipping manifests with fabricated weights, wire transfer records routed through Istanbul, Dubai, and 3 shell companies registered in Delaware. At the bottom of the stack, a classified DCIS memo linking the company's Turkish intermediary to 2 metallurgy firms on the U.S. Treasury's sanctions list. He put the folder down, checked his watch. 4:49 a.m. He picked up the radio. All elements. Execute. What followed was the culmination of one of the most complex defense contractor fraud investigations ever run out of San Diego. A case that began with a single weight discrepancy on a Navy dock intake log and ended with the exposure of a ghost invoice network reaching from a strip mall office in Chula Vista to blacklisted suppliers in Tehran. This is how it happened. The company was called Pacific Rim Integrated Supply, incorporated in California in 2021. On paper, a small defense subcontractor. Vendor registration number, GSA schedule contract. A website listing marine engineering parts and maintenance components for U.S. Navy vessel repair programs. 12 employees on the state registry. A suite address in a shared commercial building on Otay Lakes Road in Chula Vista. Nothing about it flagged for attention. That was the point. The man who built Pacific Rim was a former Navy logistics contractor named Elias Doran, 44 years old. 14 years in commercial maritime supply before starting his own firm. He understood the Navy's procurement bureaucracy the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Every approval layer, every documentation requirement, every point where a falsified invoice could pass without review. Doran knew that the Navy's vessel maintenance programs processed thousands of parts orders per quarter. He knew that the approval chain for subcontracted components under a certain dollar threshold required minimal physical verification. And he knew that the DCIS was understaffed and working a backlog that stretched years behind real-time contract activity. He built the scheme around those gaps. The core mechanism was straightforward. Pacific Rim would win a subcontract through legitimate bidding on a Navy maintenance program, specifically vessel overhaul work tied to USS-class destroyers cycling through the repair yard at Naval Station San Diego. Once under contract, the company submitted invoices for components, gaskets, valve assemblies, hydraulic fittings, electronic control modules. Items consistent with the contracted work. Items that, on paper, matched the specifications in the original purchase order. The items were never delivered. Or rather, something was delivered. Crates arrived at the receiving dock. Manifests were signed. But the crates were weighted with filler. Steel plates, sandbags, anything that would match the approximate weight on the shipping documentation. The actual components, to the extent any were sourced at all, came from a separate supply chain that Doran managed through a Turkish intermediary called Chemetechnik. Chemetechnik was not buying from certified defense suppliers. Chemetechnik was sourcing metallurgy components from 2 Iranian firms operating under sanctioned designations, companies on the U.S. Treasury's OFAC blacklist. The parts that did occasionally enter the supply chain were manufactured outside the certification standards required for U.S. naval hardware. Some were counterfeit. Some were genuine industrial components repurposed and relabeled for the defense market. The Navy wasn't just paying for parts it never received. In some cases, it was paying for parts it never wanted, parts that would have been rejected on inspection if anyone had looked. The detail that broke the case open did not come from a federal investigation. It came from a Navy contract auditor named Patricia Whelan. Whelan worked in the Defense Contract Audit Agency office attached to Naval Station San Diego. She was not investigating Pacific Rim. She was reviewing routine intake documentation for a USS-class overhaul cycle that had run through the fall of 2025. Her job that week was reconciling shipping manifests against dock intake records, something she had done hundreds of times. On November 6, 2025, she flagged a discrepancy. A shipment from Pacific Rim Integrated Supply, invoiced for $214,000 worth of hydraulic valve assemblies, had arrived at the naval station receiving dock on October 29th. The shipping manifest listed the total package weight at 847 kilograms. The dock intake log, the actual weight recorded at the receiving scale, listed 1,094 kilograms, 247 kilograms off. Whelan ran the numbers. Hydraulic valve assemblies of the listed specification would weigh approximately what the manifest claimed. No supplemental documentation explained the excess weight. No notation on the intake log indicated a packing material allowance. And when she pulled the receiving officer's signature on the intake form, she found something else. The officer who had accepted the shipment had retired from the Navy's procurement office 8 months earlier. He had signed a receiving form after he'd left government service. Whelan flagged the file. Her supervisor called the Naval Criminal Investigative Service duty officer. The NCIS duty officer, recognizing this touched procurement fraud, called HSI, San Diego, and DCIS. By November 12, 2025, a joint investigative team had formed. One detail kept pulling me back when I went through the case file. The weight discrepancy was 247 kilograms, significant but not enormous. What Whelan had actually noticed wasn't the number itself. It was that the number was wrong in the wrong direction. Filler material used to simulate legitimate cargo tends to run heavier than the actual goods, not lighter. Someone had miscalculated their ballast. 18 months of running this scheme. One miscalculation. That was all it took. The joint investigation team assigned to Pacific Rim included agents from HSI, San Diego, the Defense Criminal Investigative Service Field Office, and ICE. Internal designation, Operation Harbor El Dija. The first 60 days produced almost nothing. Pacific Rim's corporate structure was clean. The company's DCAA audits were current. Its GSA registration was valid. Elias Doran had no criminal history. His business partner, Rashid Yilmaz, who served as logistics director and managed the Chemetechnic relationship, held dual Turkish-American citizenship and had no sanctions exposure of his own. 3 months of financial surveillance. Transaction monitoring on 6 bank accounts tied to the company and its principals. Subpoenas for email records. Results. Nothing that couldn't be explained by a small contractor managing multiple vendor relationships. The HSI case agent, a 15-year financial crimes veteran named Sandra Krebs, told her supervisor in January 2026 that the investigation needed a different approach. The paper trail was deliberately obscured. The invoices were internally consistent. The falsification was happening at the physical level, at the dock, at the receiving point, not in the accounting records. To prove the fraud, they needed to get inside the operation. What Krebs proposed was a UC insertion. An undercover agent posing as a competing subcontractor, someone with legitimate defense vendor credentials, approaching Yilmaz with a joint venture proposal. Not buying from Pacific Rim, competing with them. Creating a scenario where Yilmaz would need to explain his competitive advantage to lock down a supposed partnership deal. The proposal went to HSI's Undercover Operations Unit in January 2026. Approval came back in 3 weeks. 2 undercover operators were assigned. Operator A would play a San Diego-based marine parts broker looking to break into defense subcontracting. Operator B would play a logistics consultant advising on Turkish supply chain connections. The cover identities were built over 6 weeks. Fictitious company registered. GSA vendor profile created. LinkedIn presence established. References fabricated. The operators began making contact in the defense contractor community in mid-February 2026, attending a vendor networking event, making introductions, building the kind of background noise that legitimate business people generate. First contact with Rashid Yilmaz occurred on February 28, 2026, at a defense industry mixer at a hotel in downtown San Diego. It was casual. Operator A handed Yilmaz a business card. They exchanged 4 sentences about the Navy's upcoming maintenance contract cycle. Nothing operationally significant. But Yilmaz accepted the card and followed up the next morning with an email. That email was the first entry in what would become a 340-page communications log. The relationship developed over 6 weeks. Operator A positioned himself as someone who had Navy vendor relationships but lacked Turkish supply chain access. Yilmaz positioned Pacific Rim as a company with deep Istanbul connections and a reliable, cost-effective sourcing model for marine components. In the third meeting, on March 19, 2026, at a restaurant in the Gaslamp Quarter, Yilmaz said something the undercover operators later described in their reports as a confession-level disclosure. He said Pacific Rim's pricing advantage came from sourcing outside the standard defense certification pipeline. He said his Istanbul contact, referring to Chemetechnik, had relationships with manufacturers in Eastern markets who could produce components to military specification at a fraction of the domestic cost. He said the components were reclassified on import documentation. He said the weight variances on receiving documentation were a known variable that his inside contacts at the naval station managed. Operator B, playing the logistics consultant, asked directly, "Inside contacts like who?" Yilmaz paused for a long moment. Then he said there were two individuals on the procurement side who had an arrangement. The name of the first individual surfaced 4 days later when Yilmaz sent Operator A an encrypted message through a commercial messaging platform. The message included a partial name and a reference to a procurement office role. Cross-referencing against Navy personnel records, HSI identified the individual as a former Navy contracting officer named Marcus Webb, who had retired from active service in March 2025 and immediately taken a civilian consulting role through a company whose registered address was the same shared commercial building as Pacific Rim. The second insider took 2 more weeks to surface. His name was Christopher Halsey. He was not retired. He was currently serving as a procurement specialist at Naval Station San Diego. He had approved 17 of the 214 fraudulent invoices in the Pacific Rim billing record. He had been on Doran's payroll since mid-2024, receiving payments through peer-to-peer transfer accounts in amounts under the bank reporting threshold. What's most surprising about this case isn't the scale of the fraud. It's the patience. Halsey was on the inside for nearly 2 years before investigators found a single thread leading to him. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't spending beyond his means in any obvious way. He received the payments, approved the invoices, and did nothing that generated financial noise. The operation expanded. DCIS took a more active role in the insider investigation. A separate surveillance stream was established for Halsey. Webb was added to the target list. By April 2026, the evidence package covered 214 fraudulent invoices totaling $38, $2 million in false billings. Shipping manifest forgery. Sanctions evasion through Chemetechnik's sourcing relationship with 2 Iranian metallurgy firms designated under OFAC. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. 2 federal employees, 1 active, 1 retired, on the inside. Then the investigation nearly collapsed. On April 11, 2026, one of Yilmaz's encrypted messages to an overseas contact was intercepted and partially decoded by a foreign intelligence partner. The message referenced increased attention from unnamed federal parties. It wasn't specific. It wasn't definitive. But Krebs read the intercept and understood that Yilmaz was running counter-surveillance awareness. He was watching. If he moved to alert Doran, the target network would scatter. Assets would be moved. Communications would go dark. 14 months of investigative work would produce, at best, a partial case against peripheral actors. The team had to decide, accelerate to arrest, or hold and risk losing the case. Krebs put the question to her supervisor. Her supervisor escalated it to the HSI special agent in charge for San Diego. The SAC consulted with the DCIS field office chief and the U.S. Attorney's office. The call came back within 48 hours. Accelerate. The arrest and search warrant package, in preparation since mid-March, was finalized over a 2-week sprint. 14 arrest warrants, 8 search warrants, 4 primary target locations, Pacific Rim's Chula Vista office, a commercial storage facility in National City, Doran's residential property in La Mesa, a secondary office used by Webb in the Kearney Mesa area. A 5th search warrant covered a server array registered to a Delaware shell company but physically located at a data center in the Miramar district. The operation was scheduled for the pre-dawn window of May 14, 2026. HSI tactical elements from San Diego and Los Angeles would execute simultaneously across all 4 primary locations. ICE enforcement teams would cover secondary arrest locations. DCIS agents would accompany the HSI team at the Chula Vista office to provide technical guidance on documentary evidence. Marcus Webb's arrest would be handled separately, with a 2-agent team making contact at his La Jolla residence. Christopher Halsey was the most sensitive target. Arresting an active Navy service member required coordination with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and notification to the base commanding officer. That coordination was handled under strict compartmentalization. The CO was notified at 4:30 a.m. on the morning of the operation. simultaneous with the deployment of arrest teams. Halsey was arrested at 5:12 a.m. at his home in Santee. There's a line in the indictment that reads almost like fiction. In the section describing the Chematechnic sourcing relationship, the document states that between March 2024 and October 2025, Pacific Rim Integrated Supply received and processed 57 shipments of components sourced from sanctioned Iranian suppliers. Components that were then either used as filler cargo in false weight shipments to the Navy or relabeled and sold as certified defense grade hardware to third-party buyers in the commercial maritime market. The Navy was being billed for parts it never received. The parts that were received, in some cases, were going to other buyers entirely. The network wasn't just defrauding the government, it was running a parallel distribution operation on the side. Think about the HSI forensic accountants who spent 2 weeks tracing those secondary sales. Every recovered dollar had to be tracked backward through shell accounts, matched to specific invoices, and cross-referenced against import documentation that had been deliberately falsified. They were reconstructing a financial architecture that Doran had spent 18 months designing to be invisible. Here's the take that will probably draw some criticism. The real failure here wasn't Halsey or Webb. It was the verification gap that let 214 invoices clear the approval chain without a single physical inspection of received goods. 2 insiders helped, but the system they exploited was already broken before they got involved. A receiving process that allows weight-falsified shipments to clear without independent verification isn't a system with one bad actor. It's a system that created the conditions for this to exist. The DCIS has since initiated a review of receiving protocols at all major naval maintenance facilities. That review was ongoing as of the filing date, back to May 14th. The first team breached the Pacific Rim office at 4:51 a.m. The building was a 2-story commercial structure in a mixed-use strip on Otay Lakes Road. The target suite was on the 2nd floor. HSI agents made entry through the main stairwell and the external emergency exit simultaneously. The office was unoccupied. Elias Doran was not there. This was expected. Doran's residential address, the La Mesa property, was the primary arrest location for him. The Chula Vista office was a document and evidence site. Agents recovered 12 bankers' boxes of physical files, 4 desktop computers, 2 external hard drives, and a locked safe that required a drill team. Inside the safe, $4, 1 million in bundled U.S. currency, 2 passports, 1 American, 1 Canadian, issued in Doran's name. A third passport in a name that did not match any individual on the arrest warrant list. That third passport became a separate investigative thread. At 5:03 a.m., the La Mesa residential team knocked and announced at Doran's address. No response. The entry team breached the front door at 5:06 a.m. Doran was inside. He was in the kitchen, dressed, with a travel bag packed and sitting beside the back door. On the counter next to the bag, a prepaid phone that had been used to place 3 calls in the 45 minutes before the breach. 2 calls to a number registered to a Chematechnic company contact in Istanbul. 1 call to a number in Vancouver, British Columbia, he had known, or suspected. Not enough time to run, but enough time to warn. The Istanbul number went unanswered. The Vancouver number was answered, but the person who picked up disconnected after 3 seconds. Canadian law enforcement was notified. As of the filing date of the indictment, the Vancouver contact had not been identified. Doran was placed under arrest at 5:08 a.m. He said nothing. At the National City Storage Facility, the third search team found what the warrant described as a server farm. 22 rack-mounted servers in a temperature-controlled unit, accessed through a biometric keypad that HSI technicians bypassed using override equipment brought specifically for the operation. The servers contained encrypted communications between Pacific Rim, Chematechnic, and the 2 Iranian supplier companies. The encryption was commercial grade but not sophisticated. HSI's cyber unit had the first extraction layer completed by 8:30 a.m. The 3 luxury vehicles seized that morning were a Range Rover registered to Doran, a Mercedes-Benz G-Class registered to Yilmaz, and an Audi registered to a company name that traced back to one of the Delaware shells. Rashid Yilmaz was arrested at 5:17 a.m. at his La Jolla condo. He did not resist. He said one sentence to the arresting agent, "I want to speak to a lawyer." He has not spoken to investigators since. By 6:30 a.m., all 14 arrests were complete. No injuries, no incidents, no resistance beyond Doran's pre-dawn warning calls. The operation took 63 minutes from first entry to last arrest. What do you think? Did the procurement system fail here? Or does the blame fall on the individuals who built the scheme? Drop it in the comments. because the answer matters more than it might seem. The indictment, unsealed on May 15, 2026, listed charges across 14 defendants. Elias Doran faced the most severe exposure: wire fraud, major fraud against the United States, sanctions violations under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and conspiracy. Maximum sentencing exposure on the federal charges exceeded 30 years. Rashid Yilmaz faced the same wire fraud and IEPA charges, plus an additional count of making false statements to federal investigators based on a 2025 DCIS interview he had given under the mistaken belief he was not yet a target. Marcus Webb, the retired procurement officer, faced wire fraud and bribery charges. His attorney released a statement on the afternoon of May 15th indicating that Webb was cooperating with prosecutors. Christopher Halsey, the active duty Navy procurement specialist, was the arrest that drew the most attention in the defense contracting community. He faced all of the counts applied to Webb, plus an additional charge under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. His court-martial proceedings were initiated in parallel with the civilian federal case. The remaining 10 defendants included Chematechnics U.S. based operations manager, 3 individuals who served as drivers and logistics coordinators for the physical shipment falsification, 2 individuals associated with the commercial maritime resale operation, and 3 individuals whose roles in the network were described in the indictment as facilitative participants in the invoice generation process, a designation suggesting clerical involvement in the fraud but less direct exposure to the supply chain sanctions evasion. The most senior Chematechnic principal, the Istanbul-based director who managed the Iranian sourcing relationships, was not arrested on May 14th. He was in Turkey. An Interpol red notice was filed on May 15th. Turkish cooperation on extradition requests of this type has historically been inconsistent. As of the writing of this account, he has not been extradited. The 2 Iranian metallurgy firms identified in the indictment as sanctioned suppliers cannot be prosecuted in U.S. federal court. Treasury's OFAC designated them for enhanced sanctions monitoring in June 2026. The practical effect on their operations is limited. The 3rd passport found in Doran's safe, the one in the unidentified name, was examined by HSI's document forensics unit. The passport was genuine. It was issued to a real individual. That individual's name and connection to Doran had not been publicly disclosed as of the date of the indictment. The 3 prepaid phone calls Doran made before his arrest remain a thread in the investigation. The Vancouver contact was never identified. The 2 Istanbul calls went unanswered. There is no public indication of what information Doran transmitted in those 3 calls or whether the recipients received enough warning to act on it. The $4. $1 million in currency recovered from the Chula Vista safe represented approximately 10 cents on every dollar of the $38. $2 million fraud total. Federal prosecutors filed asset forfeiture claims against the seized vehicles, the server equipment, and all identified financial accounts tied to the defendants. Total recovered asset value at the time of filing was estimated at $6, $8 million, $31 million. The bulk of what was billed and paid over 18 months has not been recovered. One detail that stuck with me: the DCIS memo that first connected Chematechnic to the sanctioned Iranian firms was written in September 2025. It was filed internally. It sat in a review queue for 6 weeks before an analyst flagged it as potentially relevant to the weight discrepancy case that Whelan had already opened. 6 weeks. During that window, Pacific Rim submitted 11 more fraudulent invoices totaling just under $2, $3 million. The DCIS has since modified its interagency alert routing protocols. According to a department spokesperson, that modification reduced average flagging delay from 6 weeks to 4 days. The case file now runs over 4,000 pages. Most of it will not be made public until after the trials conclude. If you've been following defense contractor fraud cases, comment below whether you think we'll see a part 2 when the sentencing phase completes. Because what happened at the plea negotiations is a story of its own. By the time summer 2026 arrived, preliminary hearings were underway in the Southern District of California. Doran's legal team filed motions challenging the legality of the undercover operation on entrapment grounds. The motion was denied in June 2026. Webb's cooperation agreement was confirmed in court filings, indicating that he had provided testimony regarding the mechanics of the Halsey relationship and the timeline of the insider arrangement. Halsey remained in a holding pattern between his UCMJ proceedings and the civilian federal case. His attorney had filed for a stay of the civilian proceedings pending the military court's disposition. The request was under review. Yilmaz's attorney had made no public statements and filed no substantive motions as of the most recent available public records. The Chemetechnik operations manager, identified in court documents as Schenk A. Dean, had entered into preliminary cooperation discussions with prosecutors. The scope of any potential cooperation agreement was not publicly known. The DCIS, in a statement released on June 2, 2026, described the case as the largest defense contractor fraud prosecution in the agency's history involving active duty Navy infrastructure. The statement noted that the investigation had identified potential systemic vulnerabilities in the procurement verification process for components under a certain per-unit dollar threshold. The statement did not use the word widespread, but it described a vulnerability profile consistent with one. There is a version of this story where the weight discrepancy on that October 2025 intake log goes unnoticed. Whelan files the reconciliation document and moves to the next item in her queue. The number sits in a spreadsheet no one reviews again. Pacific Rim submits its next batch of invoices in November and December and into 2026. The scheme runs another year, maybe two. Total billings reach $60, $70, $80 million. The Iranian sourcing connection deepens. More components enter naval vessels that no one inspects. Whelan noticed. The number was wrong in the wrong direction, and she had done this job long enough to know that wrong numbers don't fix themselves. The network is dismantled. The infrastructure that made it profitable still exists, and $31 million is somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. Subscribe to Bureau Nightshift. The next case is already in the file.